Leviticus is a book of priestly law. Its rituals and laws are overwhelmingly organized around Israel's relationship with God. Sacrifice, purification, holiness, atonement. That is the assumption. The assumption is mostly correct. Mostly. On the holiest day of the Jewish liturgical calendar, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the Torah commands the high priest to take 2 goats. 1 goat is sacrificed to the Lord. The 2nd goat is sent alive into the wilderness for Azazel. Not symbolically for Azazel, not in the general direction of wilderness chaos for Azazel. Using the same Hebrew preposition used for God's goat, the Torah is directing a ritual animal toward a named recipient who is not God. And the name it uses is the name the Book of Enoch gives to the watcher, held primarily responsible for the corruption of humanity. 1 Enoch 10:8 states, "To him ascribe all sin." In the next hour you will understand exactly who Azazel is in the oldest available sources, the specific crimes that earned him that verdict, the punishment that followed, and the location of his binding beneath the desert. You will understand what the grammatical structure of Leviticus 16 actually requires when read without interpretive pressure. You will understand 3 distinct historical attempts to explain away the Azazel reference, the cliff interpretation, the place name hypothesis, the Christian typological reread, and the specific way each one fails. And you will understand what it means for the theology of atonement that the most important ritual in the Hebrew calendar, as preserved in Leviticus 16, was addressed to 2 recipients, God and the named source of human corruption. If the Day of Atonement, as Leviticus 16 preserves it, directed ritual attention not only toward God, but toward the specific being the Enochic tradition holds responsible for corrupting humanity, then the theology of atonement most people inherited is operating on half its original architecture. The missing half was not lost. It was reinterpreted. And the reinterpretation required the tradition to do something very specific to a named entity the Torah had addressed directly. What that act cost the theology of atonement is what this video is about. There is one detail worth holding now. The location where Azazel is imprisoned in 1 Enoch has a name, Dudael. Some scholars have proposed that this name and the wilderness destination of the scapegoat in Leviticus 16 are related. If that connection holds, the goat carrying Israel's sins is not being sent into generic wilderness. It is being sent to the exact location where its recipient is already imprisoned. Hold that. We will reach it. The verdict in 1 Enoch 10:8 is not rhetorical excess. The phrase, "To him ascribe all sin," is the divine summary judgment delivered at the commissioning of Raphael, the archangel dispatched to deal with Azazel specifically before any of the other watchers are addressed. He is named first. He is condemned most completely. If you watched the 5 Satans episode, you have the framework. Azazel was introduced there as one of 5 distinct beings with distinct crimes. This chapter does not repeat that introduction. It deepens it. What the 5 Satans episode seeded, 1 Enoch 8:1-2 specifies. Azazel's crime was not descent. That was Samyaza's crime, the leader of the 200 watchers who bound themselves by oath at the summit of Mount Hermon and descended to take human wives. Azazel descended too, But what he is charged with is categorically different. 1 Enoch 8:1 records that he taught men to make swords and shields and breastplates. He taught the use of metals. He revealed what comes from the earth and what beautifies it. And he taught women sorcery and the arts of ornament, eyeshadow, cosmetics, the techniques of seduction. In 8:2, the list continues. Bracelets, decorations, the use of antimony, the beautifying of eyelids, all manner of precious stones and dyes. This requires careful attention because the category of crime matters for everything that follows. Samyasa's transgression was carnal and collective. 200 beings made a pact, crossed a boundary, and mixed their nature with human nature through physical union. The corruption that followed from Samyasa was biological and social. The Nephilim, the violence of giants, the devouring of everything human civilization had built. It was destructive, but it was the destruction of appetites unleashed. Samyasa led beings who wanted something they should not have had. Azazel's crime is not appetite. It is instruction. He did not take anything. He gave something. He transferred knowledge, specifically, the knowledge required to manufacture the instruments of war and the techniques of seduction that transform desire into a systematic social force. He taught humanity how to kill at scale and how to manipulate each other with precision. The corruption that follows from Azazel is not the rage of giants. It is the organized, sustained, weaponized corruption that human beings inflict on each other using the tools and techniques he provided. This is why the verdict in 1 Enoch 10:8 is what it is. Samyasa's crime was bounded, his descendants are destroyed in the flood, his companions are imprisoned, the damage is catastrophic but circumscribed. Azazel's crime was epistemic. It changed what humanity knew and what humanity could do with that knowledge. The weapons he taught humanity to make are still being made. The cosmetic techniques of seduction he revealed have been elaborated across every subsequent civilization. His gift did not perish in the flood. It survived and multiplied and is embedded in human culture at every level. To him, ascribe all sin, not because he committed every sin, but because he provided the infrastructure through which sin operates at scale. God's response is correspondingly totalizing. 1 Enoch 10:4-8 records Raphael's commission in full. He is to bind Azazel hand and foot. He is to cast him into the darkness. He is to open the desert, the rough and jagged wilderness, and cast him in. He is to place upon him rough and jagged rocks, to cover him, and to cover his face so that he cannot see the light. He is to remain there until the day of the great judgment, on which he will be cast into the fire. The specific character of this punishment is worth pausing on. Azazel is not destroyed. He is not annihilated. He is bound, buried, covered, deprived of light, imprisoned in a specific location, in a specific posture of complete immobilization, waiting for a final reckoning that has not yet arrived. He is still there. He is still bound. He is present but inaccessible, culpable, but not yet finally condemned. Between his binding and his final judgment, he exists in a state of confined accountability. That location has a name. The desert where Azazel is buried beneath jagged stones Where the darkness is complete and the light cannot reach his covered face, is Dudael. The name is present in 1 Enoch 10:4. It is a specific place. We will return to it. The name matters. Azazel is bound beneath the desert of Dudael, condemned, covered, hidden beneath rock and darkness, waiting for a fire that will not come until the final judgment. He did not cease to be the entity that taught humanity the instruments of its own corruption. He is simply no longer present in the world in any visible form. What he gave to humanity is still here. He is not. But 1 Enoch is not the only ancient text that knew his name. A second tradition, written in a completely different register for a completely different institutional purpose, also addresses Azazel directly. Not as a prisoner awaiting judgment, as a recipient of ritual attention on the holiest day of the year. And what that text says about him has never been satisfactorily explained by any of the traditions that inherited it. Leviticus 16 is not peripheral. It is the legal and theological heart of the priestly system. The instructions for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the one day in the entire year on which the high priest enters the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the sanctuary, to stand in direct proximity to the presence of God. This is the most sacred ritual the Hebrew canon contains. Its instructions are binding, precise, and elaborately specified. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly what Leviticus 16 says, not what later traditions said it meant, but what the text itself states, and exactly why the major traditions that inherited it repeatedly felt pressure to explain why it did not mean exactly what it appears to say. The ritual begins in Leviticus 16:3. The high priest prepares himself. Ritual bath, sacred linen garments. He brings animals. A bull for a sin offering for himself and his household, 2 male goats for a sin offering for the people. Verses 7 through 10 specify what happens to the goats. Both goats are brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting. Lots are cast. 1 lot falls for the Lord. 1 lot falls for Azazel. Leviticus 16, verse 8. 1 lot for God. 1 lot for Azazel. That is what the text says. Not a cliff. Not a rugged wilderness. Not a symbolic direction. A name. The same name 1 Enoch 10:8 gives to the watcher buried at Dudael, the being to whom all sin is ascribed. The Torah is directing ritual attention at him on the holiest day of the year. The grammar strongly favors a named recipient reading, and the parallel is not subtle. The Hebrew preposition is la, meaning for, belonging to, directed at. It is the same preposition in both phrases, la Adonai for the Lord, la Azazel for Azazel. The grammatical construction is parallel. The Torah is using identical language to describe the destination of both ritual acts. The structure of the sentence does not permit one prepositional phrase to function as personal, and the other to function as geographic. Both are personal, or both are geographic. And no tradition has ever argued that the goat for God is going to a place called God. Leviticus 16:20-22 completes the picture. After the slaughter of the bull and the god goat and the sprinkling of blood in the Holy of Holies, Aaron returns to the living goat. He lays both hands on its head, not one hand, both, and confesses over it all the iniquities of the Israelites and all their transgressions. All their sins, he places them on the goat's head, and then he sends it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man designated for the task. The goat carries all their iniquities on itself to a barren region, and it is sent off into the wilderness for Azazel. The transfer is physical and deliberate. The sins of an entire people are named over the goat, loaded onto it by the gesture of both hands, and then sent for Azazel. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that Azazel was known as a personal evil figure in Second Temple Jewish interpretation. Texts such as 4 Q 180 to 181, associated with exegetical material on the Watchers, treat Azazel as a named being implicated in forbidden instruction and human corruption, not as a geographic location or a compound word. That does not settle every detail of what Leviticus 16 originally meant to its priestly authors, but it does establish that the personal being reading was not a late medieval invention. It was present in the Second Temple interpretive environment that stood closest to the ritual's own world. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures produced in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, already shows that ancient translators felt the difficulty of the term. Rather than settling the issue, the Greek rendering marks the beginning of the interpretive problem. Azazel was not easy to carry across into another language without explanation, and the choices translators made reflect the pressure they were under. The word demanded a decision about whether it was a name, a place, or something else. That difficulty is itself evidence. If Azazel were simply an archaic term for a cliff, there would have been nothing to decide. The text is far less ambiguous than later explanations often imply. One goat for God, one goat for Azazel. The same Hebrew preposition directing the same ritual gesture toward two recipients. What is ambiguous is not what the text says. What is ambiguous is where the goat for Azazel was supposed to go. And the answer to that question, buried in the name of the location, the later tradition attached to this ritual's geography, may resolve the most contested detail in the entire passage and connect the Leviticus scapegoat to the Enochic prison in a way that no interpreter has fully been willing to follow. The wilderness destination of the scapegoat has a name in at least one strand of tradition. That name matters. This is the detail named at the opening of this video. The place is called Dudael. We are here. 1 Enoch 10:4-5 locates Azazel's binding at Dudael, described as a dark and rough desert, distant from habitation, where the imprisoned figure is covered with jagged rocks, so that light cannot reach his face. The geography is specific: remote, barren, inaccessible, the kind of terrain that serves as both prison and punishment, where the bound figure is hidden from the world that still bears the consequences of what he taught it. Leviticus 16, in both its Hebrew text and in the later interpretive tradition that built around it, specifies that the scapegoat is sent to an uninhabited region, an arid wilderness, rough and barren. Later Jewish sources, including the Mishnah tractate Yoma, add detail. The goat is taken to a specific desolate place outside Jerusalem, to the east, into the wilderness of Judea. The geographical tradition, however imprecisely it is preserved, is consistent in its direction: east desolate, rough, far. The scholarly debate over the Dudael connection is carefully circumscribed. Loren Stuckenbruck, in his work on the Book of Giants and the Enochic tradition's treatment of Azazel, has noted the potential etymological and geographic overlap between the wilderness destination implied by the Leviticus ritual and the first Enoch place name Dudael. Philip Alexander and James Vanderkam have both worked the terrain around this connection without settling it definitively. The overlap is linguistic and contextual, not epigraphic, not geographic in any cartographically verifiable sense. The connection is a scholarly hypothesis, not a settled conclusion. The evidence is real, the certainty is not. What matters is what the connection would mean if it holds. If the scapegoat is being sent to Dudael, if the ritual's unnamed wilderness destination is, in fact, the specific location where first Enoch has already told us Azazel is imprisoned, then the logic of the ritual changes completely. It is not expulsion of sins into a void. It is not symbolic dispatch of evil into the wilderness as a kind of spiritual purging. It is return. The sins of Israel are being loaded onto the goat and sent back to the being who made them structurally possible. The crimes of a people are being returned to the teacher who gave them the instruments of those crimes. This is a profoundly different theology of atonement from the one most people have inherited. The standard account of the scapegoat ritual, even in traditions that acknowledge the ritual's strangeness, tends to frame it as removal. The sins leave the community. The community is purified. The sins disappear into the desert. But a return logic is not a removal logic. Return assumes that sins have an address, that the corruption of humanity did not arise spontaneously, but was transmitted from a specific source, and that a complete act of atonement must not only remove sin from the sinner, but acknowledge and address the origin of that sin's structural possibility. Jacob Milgram, in his landmark commentary on Leviticus, argues that the Azazel ritual represents a deliberate two-directional structure. God receives the sacrificed goat. Azazel receives the burdened goat. Milgram reads this not as polytheism or as accommodation to a demonic recipient, but as a formal acknowledgement within a monotheistic framework that the source of sin must be ritually addressed, that atonement, to be complete, must send something back to where corruption originated. The ritual's dual address is not a theological embarrassment to be explained away. It is the ritual's point. Even if the Dudael connection is not accepted, even if the geographic link between 1 Enoch and Leviticus 16 remains a hypothesis that cannot be confirmed, the directional logic of the ritual persists. The goat is for Azazel. It goes to a specific, named recipient. The sins do not disappear. They are delivered. Whether or not Dudael is Azazel's prison, the ritual's logic points in the same direction. Sins are not merely removed. They are directed at a specific named recipient who bears a specific named responsibility for them, which raises the question that every tradition inheriting this ritual has had to answer. And the three answers it produced each fail in a different and instructive way. Three distinct interpretations of the Azazel reference in Leviticus 16 have dominated the tradition that inherited this ritual. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what each one claims, why each one has genuine scholarly support, and the specific way each one fails to account for what the text actually says. Before any of that, a necessary acknowledgement. None of these interpretations was invented to deceive. Each one emerged from real theological and textual pressure and was developed by careful thinkers working seriously with a genuine problem. The instinct to provide a non-demonic reading of Leviticus 16:8 is entirely understandable. The stakes are high, the text is anomalous, and the alternative reading creates difficulties that any responsible theologian would want to address. The following critiques are not indictments of the interpreters. They are examinations of what happens when genuine intellectual effort runs into a text that will not fully yield to the pressure being applied. The first explanation is the cliff interpretation. Its source is primarily later rabbinic tradition and some medieval commentators. The claim is that Azazel is not a personal name at all, but a compound Hebrew word, as meaning strong or rugged, and El meaning God or rock, yielding a meaning of something like rugged cliff or rough terrain. On this reading, the goat is not being sent to a being. It is being sent to a geographic feature. The practice the Mishnah records of the designated man leading the goat to a cliff in the wilderness and pushing it off is taken as evidence that the cliff is the ritual's actual destination, rather than an innovation added to the text's underlying intent. This interpretation has real support. The root words exist. The geographic tradition in later rabbinic sources is real. Some Hebrew scholarship has taken the compound word hypothesis seriously as a grammatical proposal. The grammar does not survive the scrutiny it requires. The preposition la Azazel for Azazel is the same preposition used in Elah Adonai for the Lord. If la Azazel means directed at a geographic feature, then la Adonai must also mean directed at a geographic feature, and the goat for God is going to a place called God. That cannot be the reading. The grammatical construction either functions as personal in both instances, or it does not function at all. This is not a close call in the Hebrew text. The parallel is exact. The cliff interpretation requires the same syntactic structure to carry two categorically different meanings in adjacent clauses. The second explanation is the place name hypothesis. Its source is modern critical scholarship. The argument is that Azazel was an archaic place name, a specific wilderness location that was known at the time of the ritual's composition, but has since been lost to history, and that the ritual is straightforwardly geographic. The goat goes to a place called Azazel. This interpretation also has scholarly support. Place names do go lost. Geographic designations for ritual destinations are well attested in ancient Near Eastern practice. The hypothesis is not inherently implausible. It requires something implausible to work. No place called Azazel is attested anywhere in the ancient record, not in other biblical texts, not in extra-biblical sources, not in ancient Near Eastern archives, not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, not in any geographic list from the relevant period. A place name that appears exactly once and nowhere else in the entire surviving ancient record is not a suppressed geographic tradition. It is a hypothesis that exists to solve a theological problem. And the first Enoch tradition, which is substantially pre-rabbinic in its textual strata, treats Azazel unambiguously as a personal being whose location is Dudael, not as the name of a location in itself. the place name hypothesis requires overriding the oldest continuous interpretive tradition in favor of a conjecture with no corroborating evidence. The third explanation is the Christian typological reinterpretation. Its earliest surviving articulation is the Epistle of Barnabas, written in the 2nd century AD, which explicitly reads both goats as types of Christ, the slaughtered goat representing Christ's sacrificial death, the scapegoat representing Christ bearing away sin. The Azazel name is absorbed into the Christ figure. There is no longer a second recipient of the ritual's address. The dual structure becomes a single symbol, pointing forward. Typological interpretation is a legitimate hermeneutical method with a long and serious history. The Barnabas reading is not careless exegesis. It is a systematic theological application of the principle that earlier scripture prefigures later fulfillment. It has exerted enormous influence on Christian atonement theology. The method cannot do what it is being asked to do here. The Epistle of Barnabas is applying a 2nd century AD theological framework to a text written centuries earlier by authors who had no access to the fulfillment the typological reading requires. The typological interpretation explains what later Christian theology wanted Leviticus 16 to mean. It does not explain what Leviticus 16 meant when it was written, or what the priests who performed the ritual understood themselves to be doing, or what the community that received the ritual understood themselves to be participating in. Typology is a reading of later meaning backward into an earlier text. It is not an account of the earlier text's own architecture. What these 3 chapters have assembled is not a textual curiosity. It is the evidence for a single, specific claim, the Day of Atonement. As Leviticus 16 preserves, it was a ritual that acknowledged 2 recipients of its attention, God and the being held responsible for humanity's corruption. The second half of this video asks what happened when that dual address was collapsed into one, and what it cost the theology of atonement to lose the Azazel half of the ritual's original architecture. Each of the 3 explanations fails in a different direction, one grammatically, one historically, one by importing a later theology into an earlier text. But the most revealing question is not why the explanations fail. It is why they were needed at all. And the answer to that question begins with a watcher who taught humanity something it was not supposed to know, and ends with a Greek figure chained to a rock, waiting for an eagle that will not stop coming. The connection between Azazel and Prometheus has been noted by scholars. The parallel is more precise than it first appears. Before the scapegoat's return logic can be fully understood, Azazel has to be understood as a knowledge bringer. And he is not alone in the ancient world's imagination. A second tradition, in a completely different cultural register, produced a figure punished for the same act, giving humanity power it was not supposed to have. That figure is Prometheus. Azazel and Prometheus share the same structural archetype, the divine or semi-divine being who transfers forbidden knowledge to humanity and is punished by the divine order for doing so. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what that shared archetype reveals, and why the moral framing of the 2 traditions is not merely different, but inverted in a way that encodes fundamentally different theologies about the nature of knowledge and the origin of evil. Prometheus steals fire from the gods. Humanity advances. Zeus chains him to a rock. Azazel teaches humanity to make weapons and adorn itself. Humanity corrupts. God buries him in a desert, same structure, similar punishment. Opposite verdict on the act itself. Return to the structure. Both figures make the same choice: to breach the barrier between the divine sphere's knowledge and the human sphere's access to it. Both are punished for that breach by the cosmic authority that enforced the barrier. Both remain imprisoned, bound, subject to ongoing punishment, waiting for a final reckoning. The structural template is strikingly similar across traditions that had limited or debated contact with each other, or more precisely, whose contact is still a subject of scholarly debate. The moral inversion is total. In the Greek tradition, Prometheus is a hero, and his punishment is unjust. Zeus chains him not because knowledge is dangerous, but because Zeus wants to maintain power. The fire Prometheus gives to humanity is civilizing. It enables warmth, technology, survival, culture. The divine order's hostility to human advancement is tyrannical, and Prometheus's suffering is noble precisely because what he gave to humanity was good. Aeschylus builds a trilogy around this inversion. Humanity is elevated by the gift. The punisher is morally inferior to the punished. In the Enochic tradition, the verdict is the opposite. Azazel's gift is not civilization, it is weaponization. The knowledge he transfers does not enable human flourishing. It enables human beings to destroy each other with greater efficiency and to manipulate each other's desires with greater precision. The swords, the shields, the breastplates, the cosmetics of seduction, these are not advances. They are the instruments through which humanity's existing capacity for violence and corruption is amplified and systematized. God's punishment of Azazel is not tyranny. It is justice, and the verdict to him, ascribe all sin, is not hyperbole, but a forensic attribution of systemic guilt. The two traditions are not describing the same metaphysical event. They are making opposite arguments about whether the transfer of divine knowledge to humanity is a gift or a catastrophe. And those opposite arguments are embedded in the same archetype used to opposite ends, because the archetype is flexible enough to carry either verdict. The question of whether knowledge elevates humanity or corrupts it is not answered by the archetype itself. It is answered by which knowledge is being transferred and what humanity does with it. There is a third version of this figure worth noting briefly. In Sumerian tradition, Enki, the deity of wisdom, water, and craft, functions as a knowledge-giver archetype who predates both Prometheus and Azazel in the written record and is received positively as a beneficent force whose transfer of craft and civilization to humanity is a divine gift rather than a transgression. The Apkallu, the 7 sages Enki sends to humanity before the flood, are the Sumerian version of this transmission. That tradition is a standalone argument about the knowledge-giver archetype across cultures, and it has its own full episode. What the comparison across Azazel, Prometheus, and Enki makes visible is that the archetype is a structure, a container, and the theological meaning it carries is entirely determined by the tradition filling it. The same structure is used to argue for the goodness of knowledge, the danger of knowledge, and the catastrophic weaponization of knowledge, depending on which tradition is speaking and what that tradition needs the archetype to accomplish. Return to the scapegoat. In light of the Enochic tradition's specific account of what Azazel transmitted and why the transmission was catastrophic, the Leviticus ritual's logic becomes more precise. The sins being loaded onto the goat are not abstract transgressions. They are the accumulated result of the knowledge Azazel provided, the violence made possible by the weapons he revealed, the social corruption enabled by the techniques of seduction he taught, the long downstream consequence of an epistemic breach that the tradition holds him personally responsible for. Sending those sins back to him, returning them to their source, to the imprisoned figure who sits beneath jagged rocks at Dudael, waiting for a fire that has not yet come, is not expulsion. It is accounting. It is the ritual acknowledgement that the corruption of humanity has a specific origin, that the origin is still present in a specific location, and that atonement is not complete until the accounting is made. The scapegoat ritual, read in light of the Enochic tradition, is a return. Sins sent back to the being who introduced the knowledge that made them possible, imprisoned and waiting for a final reckoning. The ritual annually acknowledges but does not deliver. But the tradition that inherited this ritual did not read it that way. It could not, because by the time the theology of atonement was being consolidated, the dual address of the ritual had become a problem that could only be resolved by erasing one of its recipients. That erasure has a specific history, a specific mechanism, and a specific cost. One influential early Christian trajectory absorbed the scapegoat into the Christ type and collapsed the dual address of Leviticus 16 into a single direction. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the specific mechanism of that collapse and what it required the tradition to do to the Azazel, half of the ritual, in order for the collapse to work. The Epistle of Barnabas, written in the 2nd century AD, is the earliest surviving Christian text to explicitly interpret both goats as types of Christ. The slaughtered goat prefigures Christ's sacrificial death. The scapegoat prefigures Christ bearing humanity's sins and removing them. Both goats in this reading are a single symbol with two movements, death and removal, both of which are fulfilled in Christ's atonement. There is no second recipient. Azazel is not addressed. The sins do not go anywhere. They are simply removed. The entire ritual now points in one direction. What this required was that Azazel cease to be a person. The typological reading can only function if there is no actual named recipient of the second goat's charge. Because if there is a named recipient, then the type does not resolve into a single Christ figure. It resolves into a Christ figure and something else. The three explanations examined in chapter 4 are not independent interpretive experiments. They are, from different directions, the same project, making Azazel not a person, so that the ritual can be read as having only one theological direction. The cliff, the place name, the type, whatever their different motives and contexts, they produce the same result. They empty the second goat's destination of its named occupant. What this cost is specific. The original ritual's architecture encoded a particular account of what evil is and what atonement requires. Evil, in the ritual's logic, has a source. The source is named. The source is located. The source is still present, bound and imprisoned, but not absent from the world it shaped. Atonement in the ritual's logic must address that source directly. It must not merely remove sin from the sinner, but send it back to the entity that bears structural responsibility for its existence. The ritual is an annual acknowledgement that corruption has an address. The Christian reinterpretation retains atonement but discards the address. Christ bears the sins and removes them. Where they go is not part of the theology. The destination is irrelevant because sin is simply gone, forgiven, atoned for, no longer held against the sinner. This is a coherent and internally consistent theology of atonement, but it is a different account of what evil is. In the original ritual's logic, evil is not merely the sinner's guilt to be removed, it is a structural inheritance traceable to a specific origin. In the Christian reinterpretation, that origin is absorbed into the act of atonement itself. Christ bears sin and removes it, and the question of where sin came from is subordinated to the question of how it ends. Annette Yoshiko Reed's work on fallen angel traditions and canon formation traces the mechanism through which the Enochic tradition, which preserved the fullest account of Azazel's crimes, his verdict, his location, and the logic connecting him to the scapegoat ritual, was progressively marginalized from the available canonical record. The boundaries of the Jewish scriptural canon developed gradually, and First Enoch did not become part of the rabbinic Hebrew canon. Older scholarship sometimes described this process through the language of a Council of Jamnia, but that model is now widely questioned. What matters here is simpler. By the time Rabbinic Judaism and later Christian canon lists hardened, First Enoch no longer functioned as a shared scriptural authority outside the Ethiopian tradition, where it remains canonical scripture to this day. The later canonical marginalization of First Enoch in most Jewish and Christian traditions did not cause the collapse of the dual address. The typological reinterpretation in the Epistle of Barnabas precedes it, but the marginalization completed what the reinterpretation began. It made the tradition that preserved the Azazel connection unavailable to most subsequent readers. The dual address was not merely reinterpreted. The supporting tradition that made its logic legible was removed from view. Azazel in First Enoch, the watcher who taught humanity the instruments of its own destruction, the weapons of war, the techniques of seduction, the knowledge that makes violence systematic and social corruption precise. To him ascribe all sin, not because he committed every crime, but because he provided the infrastructure through which crime operates at scale. Leviticus 16, the holiest ritual in the Jewish calendar, the theological center of the priestly system, Yom Kippur itself, directed at two named recipients, God and Azazel. One goat for the Lord, one goat for Azazel. Identical preposition, identical grammatical structure, far less ambiguous than later explanations often imply. Dudael, the location of Azazel's binding in First Enoch, the dark and rough desert where he is buried under jagged rocks, unable to see the light. A possible geographic connection to the wilderness destination of the Leviticus scapegoat. Debated, unresolved. And if it holds, the goat is not sent into a void. It is sent to an address. 3 explanations: cliff, place name, typology, each with real scholarly support, each failing in a different direction. The cliff interpretation requires the same grammatical construction to function personally for God and geographically for Azazel simultaneously. The place name hypothesis requires a location attested nowhere else in the ancient record. The typological reread imposes a 2nd century theology onto a text whose authors had no access to the fulfillment it proposes. The scapegoat in Christian theology, reread as a type of Christ, the Azazel half of the ritual absorbed into the God half. The dual address collapsed into one, not through carelessness, through the sustained effort of serious interpreters who understood that the original ritual could not be accommodated within a theology that demanded a singular direction for atonement. What was lost? The acknowledgement, embedded in the Torah's holiest ritual, that evil has a specific source, a specific responsible party, a specific address. That atonement is not complete when sin is removed from the sinner, that the origin of corruption must itself be ritually confronted. The scapegoat was not carrying sins into oblivion. It was carrying them back. If the Day of Atonement as Leviticus 16 preserves it addressed both God and Azazel, if the ritual structure was built on the acknowledgement that evil has a specific source, that the source is named and located, and that a complete act of atonement must send corruption back to the being held responsible for its structural existence, then there are 2 ways to read what happened next. The Christian answer is that the scapegoat was always a type pointing forward to Christ. Christ bears the sins and removes them. The Azazel half of the ritual was never meant to be a permanent theological category. It was scaffolding for a truth that would eventually be expressed without it. Atonement has one direction and one recipient. The dual address was always provisional. The older answer, the one the ritual itself encodes before any theology was built around it, is that evil has a specific origin, a specific responsible party, and a specific address. The scapegoat ritual did not remove sin into nothingness. It returned sin to its source. That is not the same theology as Christ bearing sin on the cross. It is a different account of what atonement requires and what evil is. It assumes that corruption is not merely the accumulated weight of human failure, but a structured inheritance from an identifiable origin, and that a complete reckoning must not only forgive the inheritor, but confront the source. The theology of atonement the tradition settled on discarded the 2nd half of the ritual structure Leviticus 16 preserves. The half it discarded was not metaphor. It was a specific instruction directed at a named recipient, preserved in the most sacred legal document in the Hebrew canon, addressing, on the holiest day of the year, the being the oldest available tradition holds responsible for everything it asks to have removed.